destroy their missiles, ensuring that the world's #1 sponsor of terror can never obtain a nuclear weapon.
Break completely their nuclear program, break completely their missile program.
That's what the US and Israel say they want from the Iran war.
خواهان خاتمه جنگ هستیم با شرایط خودمون و به شکلی که دیگه این جنگ تکرار نشه و درسی رو بگیرن دشمنان ما که دیگه هوس حتی حمله به ایران.
That's from Iran. With a fragile ceasefire in place, but such seemingly incompatible aims, how can the warring sides ever get to peace?
Maximalist positions only get you so far. You do have to find ways to deal with what are the core issues between the United States and the Iranian regime.
So what are those core issues? And within them, what does each country want? What would they accept? What are their red lines? And do red lines even mean anything anymore? What are the chances for a longer-lasting peace? Or can they at least avoid going back to a hot war?
Never going to have a nuclear weapon.
U.S. strategy for decades has been aimed at denying Iran a nuclear weapon. Israel considers a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. That sounds like a red line. In the first round of talks in Pakistan, the American demands included that Iran must renounce all nuclear development, civilian and military. We asked Elisa Catalana-Ewers of the Council on Foreign Relations if Iran's back is to the wall after weeks of attacks, plus last June's U.S.-Israeli attack on nuclear sites.
Well, I think the reality here is that the nuclear program is deeply diminished, but it's not zero. And I think that that's the stark reality that everyone has to kind of come to terms with, that you can't erase knowledge completely. No matter how hard you try, you can diminish it, but you can't eliminate it.
Why does Iran insist on having a nuclear program, even if it is always denied that it's pursuing nuclear weapons?
The Iranian regime's position is consistent over decades now. This entitlement issue, the sense of sovereign responsibility to have the same thing that any other state would have. It's also part of its strategic calculus, right? That a nuclear program acts as a deterrent, even if that nuclear program is not weaponized.
And the American position may not be as hardened as Trump sometimes says. Reporting by the New York Times says the U.S. has privately demanded a 20-year suspension of nuclear activity. That's certainly not no nuclear activity ever. Israel has led the way on attacking Iran's nuclear capabilities, but has different end goals.
It is interesting to watch the differences in objectives kind of emerge a little bit more clearly as the war has gone on. The approach of continuing to go after bad actors, whether it's through assassination and decapitation campaigns, or looking for and finding reconstituting of the ballistic missile program, for example, is a manageable set of objectives for this Israeli government.
The problem for Netanyahu is that Donald Trump has different calculations on ending this war.
I think that for Israel, a diminished, chaotic scene inside of Iran is not the worst scenario, right? The Trump administration sees being kind of in a prolonged, sustained fight in the Middle East as politically costly, literally costly, and therefore wants to see some kind of resolution where it can claim success. And that's very personal for this American president as well.
So, U.S. President Donald Trump faces political pressure to end the war, but needs a way to declare victory. And Iran is unlikely to capitulate completely. Could the 20-year suspension be a way out, or at least a hint of the way forward for everyone?
It could. I think it would require that agreement can be spun as a narrative that the regime has not given up its sovereign right, that in fact it still has the ability to enrich should it choose to, and that it will continue to do so for the purposes of civilian use.
As hard as the nuclear issue is, finding a way for both sides to save face may be even harder for the Strait of Hormuz.
We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world.
This is arguably Iran's most effective weapon at this point. Since the start of the war, Iran has used its geography to block the strait, the transit point for 1/5 of the world's oil supply and significant amounts of other crucial products before the war.
This is where the military success has a strategic failure, in that Iran, the regime, certainly did not have this ability, this de facto control over the strait on February 27th.
If it controls the strait, it can apply severe economic pressure on the US and the rest of the world. As you may have noticed, higher energy costs aren't very popular. Controlling it lets Iran project geopolitical power far beyond its size and military strength. So where might this critical element in the war end up?
I think a couple of things are going to be pivotal in this discussion. One is a strait that can be held at risk by the Iranian regime, whether it's through a tolling system, whether it's some other de facto control, is unacceptable to those who are in the region, right? The Gulf states are going to be hard pressed to accept a scenario where Iran exerts more control over the strait than it did before. So I think the United States also can't afford politically or economically to see Iran in a position where it can exert control de facto or otherwise. So what's realistic? I mean, I do think that the ideal scenario here is an agreement whereby Iran steps back from these kind of threats to commercial shipping in the strait. How do you enforce that?
Using actual force to do that would seem difficult and unsustainable.
You do not have the support from partners and allies in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific to do this using military means.
It'll have to be a political agreement in the long term. Let's leave that as an open question. No matter what, though, whoever controls the strait stands to earn a lot of money.
If it were up to me, I'd take the oil, I'd keep the oil, and would make plenty of money.
The US and Israel have spent billions on this war. It's expensive to cause this much destruction, and it'll be expensive to rebuild. Iran has seen most of its military destroyed and its cities attacked. It wants reparations for the destruction. It wants sanctions lifted. And it wants assets abroad to be unfrozen. Is there room for maneuver here?
You're talking about billions and billions of assets and revenue that has been sitting there. So that is in some ways the mechanism that's easiest to turn back on, because arrangements around those assets were at least in place before the Trump administration took office and certainly before the war began. And so there is probably an easy arrangement, a relatively easy arrangement to be had.
What about reparations for the damage to civilian infrastructure, for example?
I cannot imagine a scenario where reparations are really on the table, but not surprised that the regime is making that kind of maximalist position going in, right? It wants to maximize its ability to argue on the economic front that there are a number of things it's looking for. What it's really looking for is access to that quick revenue in the short term.
Sanctions relief to help the Iranian economy could be trickier. They've been in place for decades and are complicated to unwind. But it looks like any peace deal is going to have to juggle short and long-term considerations, no matter what. There's also the question of national pride. All three parties to this war need to get out of it with some kind of a win, but they've been at odds for decades. Does this mean any kind of agreement to stop the fighting can only ever be a temporary solution?
I think it's incredibly difficult to imagine the kind of comprehensive peace that resolves what has been 40-something years of animosity and a very, very real adversarial behavior in this relationship between the United States and the Islamic Republic. So I do think that is harder to imagine at this point, but that does not foreclose the possibility of achieving really kind of concrete steps to manage for those many issues and differences that exist.
There are also several ticking political clocks. Both the US and Israel have important elections this year. Within 3 years, both democracies could have different leaders, and the stability of the Iranian regime is unknown. There may not be enough time for piece-by-piece trust-building exercises.
How do you build trust when you have existential questions in the regime and a time clock ticking on the Trump administration? It's a bridge too far, I think.
That issue of trust is crucial, and it's in short supply on all sides. The US and Israel started this war as negotiations were ongoing, and the US accuses Iran of lying about its refinement of uranium and intentions to build nuclear weapons. Trump regularly mocks Iranian leaders and makes violent threats on social media, while Iran mocks him back, and warns US customers that fuel prices could still rise much higher. Is it possible for diplomats to work away from all this froth? Or does it make their jobs impossible?
I do wonder whether our assumptions about what's possible and not possible get broken by an administration who doesn't focus on details and is less interested in the specifics, and so therefore has freedom of maneuver to negotiate things that are bigger than some of us might imagine.
Turning a ceasefire into peace will be a tricky project indeed, with the US seeming to play a short game, breaking rules and norms as it goes, Israel determined to remove an existential threat, and Iran focused on the long-term future. But it's the Iranian people who will be caught between a repressive government desperate to survive and the US and Israel, who may resume bombing at any time, will pay the price until a deal is struck.